Winter, 1943. The road to Murmansk was a trail of iron and ice, a corridor where metal screamed and men vanished into white silence. The Arctic convoys had done their part, delivering strange American machines to Soviet soil. Now they waited, half buried under snow, rows of glossy green trucks with round headlights and curious insignias that read GMC and Studebaker. Private Sergei Volkov, 19 years old and frostbitten to the bone, stood among them with disbelief. "These are trucks?" he muttered, brushing snow from the hood of one. "Looks like something from another planet." Comrade Petrov, his superior, grunted. "Americans. Always polishing. Let's see if it moves." The Red Army's old GZ and ZIS trucks were stubborn beasts, engines that needed the strength of 10 men and the patience of saints to crank alive. Soldiers would curse, twist, and pull on the hand starter until their palms bled, sometimes only to hear the bitter cough of failure. But the order had come from high command: inspect the new vehicles, test them for transport readiness. Sergei approached the American truck cautiously. Its paint still gleamed beneath the frost. The interior smelled faintly of leather and gasoline, not the usual mix of oil and despair that haunted Soviet machines. His breath clouded the glass as he leaned closer, tracing a finger over the unfamiliar script on the dashboard. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to a small metal button next to the steering wheel. Petrov squinted. "A switch, perhaps? Some capitalist trick." When Sergei pressed it, the truck growled to life instantly, a deep, steady purr echoing across the snowfield. The two men froze. The machine had come alive without a crank. They looked at each other, jaws slack, as if witnessing witchcraft. For a moment neither spoke. The sound of the smooth-running engine was all that filled the frozen air. Then Petrov whispered, almost reverently, "Comrade, I think the Americans have put lightning in their trucks." Within minutes, the other soldiers came running. The sound of that smooth, effortless hum spread through the depot like a rumor of spring. Men with red noses and torn gloves surrounded the truck, stamping their boots on the hard snow, eyes wide with disbelief. "Impossible," one mechanic muttered, rubbing the frost off his beard. "It can't be running already." Sergei, still at the driver's seat, simply pointed at the small silver button. "It started itself," he said. "No crank. No rope. Just this." The mechanic climbed in, hands trembling, as if touching a sacred relic. "You're telling me this button does what 5 men and a prayer couldn't?" He looked to the others for confirmation, but the answer came from the truck itself, a steady, confident rumble that mocked the very laws of Soviet endurance. Petrov crossed his arms, trying to maintain authority. "Don't look so amazed. It's just electricity. Americans have plenty of it. They waste it on everything." But even he couldn't hide his awe. The soldiers crowded closer. They opened the hood and stared into the engine compartment. Clean wiring, tight bolts, smooth metal surfaces untouched by years of repair. It was nothing like their crude, rust-patched workhorses. "This looks like it was made by machines," Sergei whispered. "Of course it was," said a voice behind them. It was Major Orlov, their logistics officer, his overcoat heavy with frost. "Americans build these as if they were toys. They call them Lend-Lease. We call them miracles." The men chuckled, but quietly. The word miracle lingered too long in the cold air. Orlov circled the truck, brushing snow from its fenders. "Electric starter, sealed bearings, even heating in the cab. And they say these trucks never freeze." One soldier snorted. "Never freeze? We'll see about that. Everything freezes here, even hope." But as the wind howled and the American truck idled steadily, that cynical remark seemed smaller than ever. Sergei ran his gloved hand over the door, reading the faint English letters beneath the frost. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel what they meant. It wasn't just a machine. It was a promise that somewhere, beyond the snow and silence, another world still believed in comfort, precision, and light. The next morning, the experiment became a spectacle. Every unit in the depot gathered around the strange American trucks. Word had spread that they could start themselves like enchanted horses, no cranks, no frozen fingers, no swearing under the northern wind. The quartermaster, a stooped old sergeant named Mikhailov, arrived with a hand crank from one of the old ZIS trucks, waving it like a relic. "You see this?" he shouted, his voice echoing over the frost. "This is how a real Soviet engine starts, through effort, through will." He jammed the crank into the socket of a nearby ZIS and began to twist. The engine coughed, spat smoke, and refused. Again he turned it, veins rising in his neck, until the truck reluctantly sputtered to life with a choking roar. The soldiers cheered half-heartedly, more out of pity than pride. Then Major Orlov gestured to Sergei. "Now, show them how the Americans do it." Sergei climbed into the Studebaker. He didn't even look cold anymore. There was something almost smug in the way he brushed the snow off the windshield. He pressed the little metal button. The engine started instantly, smooth and deep like a bear waking up from sleep. No shouting. No pulling. No swearing. Only silence, broken by a few astonished laughs. Mikhailov froze, hands still gripping the old crank. He looked at the button, then at the crowd. That's cheating," he muttered, as if the machine had insulted the honor of Soviet labor itself. Petrov barked a laugh. "Comrade Sergeant, perhaps it's not cheating, perhaps it's progress." The older man scowled but didn't answer. Around them, the laughter grew louder, lighter. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't at anyone's expense, it was joy, pure and electric. Later that day, as the convoy prepared to move out, Sergei sat in the cab of the truck, his hands resting on the warm steering wheel. The sun was setting low, reflecting on the metal hood like liquid fire. He thought of the crank, that iron symbol of effort and misery. He thought of how it had taken a single button to replace it. He smiled faintly, realizing that this small discovery wasn't just about a machine. It was about the idea that life didn't have to be a constant struggle. That maybe, somewhere far away, people had learned how to make things easier, and not be ashamed of it. The following week, a convoy of the American trucks departed eastward, green giants rumbling through white infinity, their engines purring in unison like a mechanized choir. Sergei drove near the front, proud and nervous, gripping the wheel as if holding a piece of another world. The landscape was endless. Pines bowed under the weight of snow. The road was little more than a suggestion carved into ice. The trucks moved steadily, their broad tires crushing frost that once defeated every Soviet vehicle that came before them. Behind Sergei, Petrov leaned forward in the passenger seat, his eyes narrow. "You know," he said, "I used to think everything from the West was weak, soft, made for people afraid of hardship." Sergei smiled faintly, his breath fogging the windshield. "And now?" Petrov chuckled. "Now I think, maybe comfort isn't weakness." They rode in silence for a while. The rhythmic hum of the Studebaker engine filled the cabin, steady as a heartbeat. Occasionally, Sergei looked out the window and saw the other trucks, some marked with white stars, some carrying crates labeled in strange English letters, spare parts, rations, radio components. Every time he pressed the starter button after a short stop, the truck responded instantly, obediently. No freezing, no shouting, no prayer. Just movement. Progress. As night fell, the convoy reached a small village recently reclaimed from the Germans. The houses were burned-out shells, their roofs black and twisted. The only sign of life was a small group of children standing by the road, their faces pale in the dim light. Sergei slowed the truck. One of the boys, no older than 10, pointed at the bright headlights and whispered something to his sister. She laughed, the sound fragile, almost alien in the silence. Sergei reached into his ration bag and tossed them a small tin of canned peaches. They caught it with wide eyes as if he had thrown them gold. Petrov watched the children disappear into the shadows. "Electric starters," he murmured. "Canned peaches. Radios. Maybe the Americans are winning because they build machines that make life a little less cruel." Sergei didn't answer. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the running engine, he understood something simple and dangerous. Technology wasn't just changing the war. It was changing men, showing them that life didn't always have to be suffered through to have meaning. The convoy halted at an abandoned farmhouse for the night. Snow blanketed the fields in silence, and the cold bit through every layer of cloth. But inside Sergei's truck, the heater hummed softly, another American miracle. The warmth felt almost treasonous. Petrov and a few others gathered around the truck to share a smoke. One of them, a wiry engineer named Anatoly, carried a small wooden crate marked communications equipment. He cracked it open with his knife. Inside lay a compact American field radio, sleek, black, with clean dials and neat lettering that looked almost artistic compared to the crude Soviet models they were used to. From the same land where trucks start themselves, Anatoly said with a smirk. Maybe it sings too. They set it up on a crate near the campfire, connecting the antenna. The radio hissed to life, spitting static into the dark. After a few turns of the dial, a miracle. Music. A soft, melancholy jazz tune slipped through the air, muted trumpets and smooth piano, like a whisper from another universe. The soldiers froze. For years, all they had known were the rhythms of marching boots, the shrieks of shells, the occasional folk song carried by tired voices. But this was different. American music, Petrov murmured. It sounds sad, but free. No one spoke for a while. The fire cracked and hissed. The snow glittered faintly under the moonlight. In the distance, artillery echoed, a dull reminder that the world hadn't yet ended. Sergei closed his eyes, letting the music fill him. For a moment, he imagined the people who had built these trucks, these radios, a nation across the ocean, untouched by ruin, where electricity hummed in every home and people danced instead of marched. When the tune ended, Anatoly lowered the volume and exhaled. They say the Americans fight with machines, but I think they fight with comfort, with hope. Petrov threw his cigarette into the snow. Hope doesn't win wars, he said quietly. But maybe it keeps men from becoming machines themselves. Sergei glanced at the Studebaker. The dashboard lights glowed faintly blue in the dark. A machine that started with a button. Music that crossed oceans. He wondered, when the war was over, would they go back to cranks and silence? Or would they remember the night the Red Army heard jazz beneath a Soviet sky? By dawn, the convoy moved again, headlights slicing through fog like blades of pale fire. The men were silent, heavy with the strange feelings the radio had left behind. The world seemed a little wider now, the war a little smaller. They drove for hours through a maze of ice-clogged roads and frozen forests. The American trucks devoured the distance, their engines steady, unbothered by the cold that crippled Soviet models. In the rearview mirror, Sergei saw the line of Studebakers stretching endlessly behind him, a river of motion through a frozen graveyard. Petrov sat beside him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You hear the officers talking last night?" he muttered. "They say these trucks, these American things, they're saving entire divisions. Without them, we'd have no supplies at the front." Sergei nodded. "Maybe they'll help us win faster." Petrov snorted. "Maybe. But victory borrowed is still borrowed. The motherland will never admit it was the Americans who kept us alive." Sergei said nothing. He didn't want to argue. The truth hung in the air like exhaust, visible, undeniable, but fleeting. Hours later, the convoy stopped near a half-destroyed bridge. Engineers scrambled to check its strength. Sergei climbed down from the truck, stretching his frozen limbs. In the distance, he saw smoke rising from the horizon, the front. The real war. A young lieutenant approached him, clipboard in hand. "Driver, how's the truck handling?" "Like it doesn't know what winter is," Sergei replied. The lieutenant chuckled. "Good. Keep it that way. Command says if the Lend-Lease stops, so does the Red Army." As the men worked to reinforce the bridge, Sergei walked toward the edge of the river below. The ice was cracked, the currents still alive beneath it. He thought of the endless miles behind them, the ruins, the music, the light that came from a button. Maybe the Americans didn't fight on the same front, he thought, but their machines carried something the Red Army had forgotten, a quiet belief that progress could be human, not just industrial. When the bridge was finally cleared, the trucks rolled forward one by one. Sergei pressed the starter again, feeling the engine come alive under his hand. The convoy crossed, the ice groaning beneath their weight, men, machines, and miracles moving east toward the fire. And for the first time, Sergei felt that the war was not only about survival. It was about learning what kind of world they wanted to live in after. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of Smolensk, the world had turned gray. Smoke from distant battles hung like ghosts between the trees. Charred tanks lined the road, twisted skeletons of German and Soviet steel alike. The soldiers didn't speak much anymore. They were deep inside the machine of war now, and silence was the only language that made sense. Sergei drove with a kind of reverence. The Studebaker engine hummed faithfully beneath him, untouched by exhaustion. It felt less like a machine and more like a companion, a living thing that carried them through chaos. At one checkpoint, they stopped beside a line of Soviet GZ trucks, rusted, coughing, their drivers red-eyed and shivering. A mechanic from the old column wandered over, eyeing Sergei's vehicle with a mix of envy and disbelief. "You're from the Murmansk convoy?" he asked. Sergei nodded. The man ran a gloved hand along the Studebaker's hood. "We've been trying to start ours since dawn." Crank snapped in the cold. Two men nearly froze. He paused, then looked up, confused. "Yours is still running?" Sergei smiled faintly and pointed to the button on the dash. "Electric starter." The mechanic laughed softly, but his eyes carried something heavier, not just wonder, but sadness. "You know what's strange? I look at this truck and realize how much we've learned to suffer. As if that's all we know how to do." He turned away before Sergei could answer, disappearing into the fog. Petrov, sitting nearby, murmured, "He's right. We take pride in endurance, even when it breaks us." The convoy moved on, leaving the broken GZ trucks behind. Soon, they reached a village half buried in ash. Roofs collapsed under snow, windows shattered, only the church spire still standing, blackened, like a finger pointing to heaven in accusation. They stopped to deliver food and fuel to a small Soviet unit dug in nearby. Children appeared again, gaunt faces, hollow eyes. Sergei handed them tins of meat and smiled weakly. One of them whispered something in Russian he barely caught. "Are you Americans?" He shook his head. "No. Soviet." "But the truck?" He hesitated, looking at the Studebaker. "It's from a friend." That night, as snow began to fall again, Sergei sat by the fire and stared at the truck glowing faintly under the moon. He realized it wasn't just steel and wires. It was a symbol of something they'd forgotten existed: generosity without conquest, progress without cruelty. And he wondered if the world after the war could ever understand the difference. 2 weeks later, the convoy reached the edge of the front lines, a wasteland of shattered trees, burned soil, and iron carcasses. The wind carried the smell of cordite and wet ash. Here, even miracles rusted quickly. The order came to halt and offload supplies. Sergei parked the Studebaker beside a mound of frozen earth, the headlights cutting through the mist. When he turned the key to silence the motor, the sudden quiet felt strange, as if a heartbeat had stopped. The front was chaos. Trucks came and went, their loads of ammunition and food disappearing into the smoke. Soldiers moved like shadows, faces hidden behind grime. Every few minutes, artillery rolled somewhere beyond the hills, shaking the ground like the pulse of an angry god. Sergei stepped down, stretching his back. He watched as Petrov supervised the unloading. Nearby, Anatoly was helping a medic lift crates marked with red crosses. Then, without warning, a German shell fell short of its target. The explosion tore through the air, flinging snow and shrapnel like a storm of metal. Sergei dove to the ground. When the dust settled, a single truck lay in ruin, its cab twisted, its wheels spinning uselessly in the snow. It wasn't the Studebaker, but one of the Soviet ZIS trucks behind them. The difference between them was night and day. The American trucks, lower to the ground, with reinforced frames, had taken the blast better. The Soviet one had folded like paper. When the wounded were carried away, Petrov stood in silence, staring at the wreck. "These machines," he said softly, almost to himself. "Maybe they're saving more than just fuel." That night, as snow fell again, Sergei climbed back into the cab and sat with his hands on the steering wheel. The engine was still warm from the day's drive. He pressed the button, and it started instantly, a quiet purr in the middle of war. For a moment, he imagined a world where engines started not for battle, but for travel, for life. Where buttons replaced cranks not to save time, but to spare men's strength for gentler things. He let the truck idle, its hum soft as a lullaby, and closed his eyes. Around him, the world was burning. Inside, it was calm, and that calm felt like rebellion. Days later, the convoy prepared for its final stretch toward Belarus. Snow had begun to melt, turning the roads to mud, a new enemy for every truck. Yet the Studebakers kept moving, their wide tires biting through the slush where Soviet models sank helplessly. At camp one night, Sergei found a quiet moment inside his truck. He took out a small notebook, the pages damp and smudged, and began to write a letter he would never send. To whoever builds these machines. You don't know me. You don't know the world I come from. But your hands, your bolts, your wires, they've kept men alive who might have died in the snow. When I press the button and hear the engine start, it feels like I'm touching something more than metal. It feels like I'm touching the idea that life doesn't have to hurt this much. If we ever meet, I will thank you, not as an enemy, but as a man who has seen a glimpse of a gentler world. He paused, staring at the ink freezing on the page. Then he folded the letter and tucked it behind the dashboard, next to a small Soviet badge. Two symbols side by side, the red star and the idea of progress that had come from across the ocean. Outside, Petrov was talking with Anatoly near the fire. "They say after the war, we'll have factories like this too," Petrov said, warming his hands. "Electric starters, heaters, maybe even radios in every home." Anatoly grinned. "If the party allows it. Comfort makes people ask questions." Sergei smiled to himself in the cab. They were right. These trucks were more than tools. They were ideas disguised as machines. Every button pressed, every smooth start, whispered a dangerous truth: things could be better. Later that night, as he tried to sleep, he heard distant artillery. It no longer terrified him the way it once had. He knew the end was coming, not just for the war, but for the world that believed suffering was sacred. And in that thought, somewhere deep in the hum of memory and metal, Sergei found peace. When morning came, he pressed the button again. The Studebaker awoke instantly, obedient, faithful, alive. By the spring of 1945, the war was a broken clock still ticking out of habit. The Red Army was pushing west, and everywhere they went, the landscape looked the same: ruins, silence, ghosts. But the Studebakers kept rolling, green and sturdy, their engines singing the last songs of a dying world. On the road outside a ruined Polish town, Sergei's convoy stopped for fuel. He stepped out of his truck and looked toward the horizon, a horizon that no longer felt unreachable. Somewhere beyond that line lay Berlin, and beyond Berlin, an ending. Petrov joined him, hands in his coat pockets. "When this is over," he said, "they'll send the American trucks back. Or melt them for steel. Can't have the people thinking someone else built better machines." Sergei smiled faintly. "Maybe. But people will remember. You can't melt an idea." Petrov gave a half-laugh. "You think the people care about ideas? They'll just be glad to stop dying." Sergei didn't answer. He walked back to the Studebaker and rested his hand on the hood, still warm from the drive. The paint was chipped, the fenders scarred, but it had never once failed him. He thought of all the mornings it had started in one touch, when every other engine had frozen solid, and of the look on the soldiers' faces the first time they heard it come alive without a crank. A button. Just a button, and yet it had changed the way he saw the world. He climbed into the cab one last time and pressed it. The engine started instantly, as always, with that quiet, confident growl. But this time, he didn't drive. He just sat there, listening. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells from the ruins. For a moment, the war seemed far away, smaller than the sound of that motor, smaller than the warmth in his hands. When he finally shut off the engine, the silence that followed was complete. Years later, they would tell the story differently, about victory, about sacrifice, about glory. But somewhere, deep in the memory of a soldier named Sergei Volkov, the true miracle of that winter would always remain. Not the guns, not the battles, not even the victory. Just a machine that started with a touch of a finger. And the realization that even in the coldest age of history, humanity still had the power to make life gentler.